Thank you very much. As you said in your concluding word, indeed, one of the purposes of this forum is precisely to discuss these global issues with a wider community, not just the technical community. And we have time for a few questions, and I received by Professor Bruni a signal that he would like to address a question to you. Professor Bruni.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your speech and for being here, also on behalf of my colleagues and the students. We appreciated very much your global picture, and my question will be as global as I can. The current global situation suggests that crisis management systems are important elements in global economic governance. And I would appreciate any general comments that you might want to offer us on the optimal shape of what I would call ex-ante crisis management arrangements, which are different from the ex-post. Ex-ante crisis management can be designed with more emphasis on avoiding defaults, reassuring the creditors, or on the contrary, with more emphasis on dealing with defaults, thus making them less traumatic for the economy and easier to allow. Some equilibrium is needed between these two aims, but also some bias is required to make the system credible and clear. And I wonder, which is your bias? And as an example, let me cite deposit insurance systems that in Europe could be improved very much, I think, but could also be abolished, as far as I understand, because the crisis is teaching us that we seem that we don't want to deal with defaults, and that to avoid defaults, when it comes the moment, 100% last-minute deposit insurance is offered by governments. Crisis management systems can also be different according to their reliance on what is called constructive ambiguity. Should we try to organize clear and transparent procedures to deal with potential defaults, or should we maximize the containment of moral hazard by keeping them rather vague, informal, and improvised, so that nobody can really count on any help and debtors have a stronger incentive to discipline themselves? And here the example is I'm sorry to mention this, I know that this is a trouble for you these days, but the current turmoil on sovereign debt in Europe. Both the heads of state and government, and to a lesser extent the ECB, seem, in my impression, to rely a lot on constructive ambiguity now to convince the pigs to become disciplined. But suppose we overcome this crisis. Would you suggest for the future a more structured ex-ante mechanism to deal with private and public defaults, perhaps explicitly contemplating bailouts in the treaty? Or are you satisfied with the current reliance on constructive ambiguity, on improvised and imprecise commitments to help the defaulting private and public debtors? Thank you.
I think, of course, your questions are extremely pertinent, and you are, I would say, stressing all the issue of moral hazard and how to avoid as much as possible moral hazard in these circumstances, particularly, I have to say, in designing ex ante the set of rules, regulations, prudentials, and or not, possible help coming from the public authorities. I really trust that this is an issue which is one of the most important. The intensity of the crisis demonstrated very, very clearly that a very large number of market participants, institutions, instruments were accepting wrongly a degree of risk which was totally aberrant, relying in some cases very clearly on concepts like too big to fail or too interconnected to fail. And it is clear that from that standpoint, the new architecture and the new set of rules, regulations, prudentials must not accept that. Again, as I said, we cannot afford, in my opinion, to have a second time to deal with such a crisis. Now, it is not for me to say that once the crisis erupted, it was wrong for governments in particular to step in, because otherwise we would have had, in the circumstances, the equivalent of the Great Depression. I trust, nevertheless, that it is not an option to do the same in the future, not only because it would be absurd to accumulate moral risk to that extent, but also because our democracies will not permit, they will not vote for a second time on both sides of the Atlantic to put 25% of the GDP to support the financial sector and avoid the total collapse of the financial sector and of the economy. Now, that being said, it seems to me that we have to prevent ourselves from two approaches, I'm speaking of the private sector, which would be equally dangerous. One would be to say, in any case, there would never be any help from the government in any circumstances. It would be wrong, because you could imagine circumstances, combination of circumstances, where government stepping in would be necessary. And I think that it's very difficult to deny that. We have also risks that could stem from outside the financial sector itself. We have risks that could come from nature. We have risks that could come from, I have to say, the complexity of the world in which we are, and also I insist very much on the impact of science and technology, which is transforming very profoundly the way our economies operate, the way the financial economy operates, and the nature of the financial instruments that could be invented. And we cannot block invention and creativity in any domain in a market economy. So we have to be alert, but we cannot and we should not, of course, block innovation and creativity. Equally dangerous, in my opinion, would be to say, well, there is a sphere, a constellation of institutions that are obviously big, obviously interconnected, and there we will step in if there is a major problem, if there is a default, a bankruptcy. The rest we will not, but that we will step in. It seems to me that it is equally absurd, because then we would give this institution an enormous advantage of all others, because we would know ex ante that they are protected. It would be an unfair advantage. In order to compensate this unfair advantage, you would have to augment considerably some kind of risk premia that they would have to pay for their own protection. I think this is something which will not work. So we have both, in my opinion, as you very eloquently said, to work on limiting as much as possible the systemic risk of the system itself, and for individual institutions to try to permit the unwinding of an institution. It is what we call resolution concept. You mentioned, it seems to me, this concept of resolution, to have a correct resolution concept that would permit to solve problems of big and interconnected institutions which would have major difficulty without triggering a crisis, without triggering a systemic crisis. And how very hard work is being done on that. I have to say that it seems to me that we have a lot of quite dramatic legislative change to operate, because a bank, particularly, of course, to be big and interconnected, is not an industrial company, should not be placed in the same situation legally as would be a normal business, even a big normal business. We have to take account of the special nature of banks, and therefore you would have a legal environment which would precisely permit an authority to step in, to take decisions, to organize the resolution. And I have to say that in the case of the United States, we have the example of the FDIC concept, which has liquidated a large number of banks without creating systemic impact, systemic fallout. So again, I don't say it's easy, and of course I have to mention immediately that the problem is made more complicated because it's a cross-border problem. A big and interconnected institution in present world is a cross-border institution which has a reach on in a number of countries, in a number of economies, and of course then it calls for appropriate cooperation, appropriate harmonization of the various legislation and legal framework. And again, I can tell you that we are all working on that very, very actively. I will not comment, if you permit, on the other aspect, which is the treasuries, which is the sovereign risk aspect. I have a lot of memory on that, having been chairman of the Paris Club, as you have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a question by Dottoressa Giuliana Ferraino of Corriere della Sera. Ferraino.
Bonsoir, Monsieur Trichet. Buonasera, Professor Marchetti. Buonasera, Professor Tabellini. My name is Giuliana Ferraino. I'll go back to the Eurozone. And the Greek turmoil actually has highlighted the Euro as a political project. Can you tell us how strong is this project, just in the light of the Greek situation? And can you tell us a bit more in terms of big distresses, the one we live in? And the second question is somehow correlated to the first one. And do you expect, after this tremendous financial crisis and the Greek situation, that the euro will remain the currency for 16 countries and a project for this club? Or are you expecting a push from other countries to join in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The European construction, the European integration is a historical project of incredible, bold nature, and I have to say that the success of this project, I'm speaking in a country which was at the roots of the European endeavor, European Union endeavor, the success of this endeavor has been extraordinary. I think if you had said to Alcide de Gasperi that within a period of approximately half a century, he would see a parliament, a European Parliament of 27 countries with election on the basis of universal polling, that he would see a Court of Justice extending its jurisdiction and deciding on very important jurisprudence at the level of, again, 500 million people, including, of course, all countries that were at the period of the founding father under the rule of the Soviet Union Empire. If you would have said that we would have a single market of 500 million people and a single market with a single currency of 16 countries and 330 million people, all this would have been totally unbelievable. It would have been, I don't know, some kind of a fancy tale. We have achieved historically a formidable success. And of course, it is not by chance. It is because there has been a very, very profound, I have to say, lucidity of the founding fathers. The methodology that had been imagined at the very beginning has been very wise, in my opinion, and you have been the dynamics of this phenomenon, of the historical phenomenon. I take it, of course, that the Euro endeavor is a very, very important part of this phenomenon. And I could, I don't want to be too long, but I could say the same as regards the Euro. Had you said, well, we are making the Euro now, but you can be sure that 11 years after the setting up of the Euro would be a very credible currency. The Euro would be a currency as stable in terms of keeping its value, in terms of prices, as were the best national currencies before the Euro was set up. I can say in Berlin, the Euro has kept its value over the first 11 years, will keep its value over, at the end of the year, exactly in line with our definition of price stability and without any difference with what was the stability of the previous national currency in this particular country. So, had we told the negotiator of the Maastricht Treaty that, again, 11 years after the setting up of the Euro, 16 countries would be in, it would have been considered impossible. And as you know, and I'm responding also to the second part of your question, we have 25 countries out of 27 that would enter the Euro when the criteria are met. And I always said myself that it is extremely important that nobody enters in the Euro without meeting the criteria. And meeting the criteria means, according to the treaty, not only meeting the criteria on a snapshot basis for 1 year at the moment of the entry, but meeting the criteria on a sustainable basis. It is explicitly what calls the treaty. And I also say that it is when you enter the single market with a single currency, you are very profoundly sharing a destiny in common. All those who were at the heart of the Euro area when it started, Italy and the other countries, were entering in the Euro area on the basis of a multinational, of course, accord, a very profound multinational accord, but also a multi-partisan accord, because the major sensitivities in all our countries were in agreement on the strategy. And I think that it is very important. If I have a message for the potential newcomers, it's always to tell them, look, it is a destiny that you will share in common with the other countries at the level of the, today, 330 million fellow citizens. And you have to be sure that all sensitivities in the countries understand that and share that view. Because, again, it is something which has a very, very important, I would say, conceptual nature, associating very profoundly with other countries. And in the recent period, you could see that it was very much the message of the ECB, this message of we are sharing a destiny in common, and we have to take up our responsibility, all of us, of course, the ECB for its part, and all governments individually and also as a college, as the grouping of the governments member of the euro area.
Thank you. We have time for one last and final question by Professor Andrea Sironi.
Thank you, President Trichet. I'm a banking scholar, so my question is related to banking, and it's partly related to Franco Bruni's one. It actually relates to so-called global banks, which you also mentioned as systemic banks. I see two issues which are quite relevant here. One is the one you already mentioned, i.e. too big to fail, or if you want, too entangled to fail banks. It seems to me that there are two approaches that can be highlighted. One is the one that we see in the UK, where banks such as Royal Bank of Scotland or Lloyds are forced to decrease their size by selling off part of their operations. The other one is the one that I see more in the recent December 2009 Basel Committee proposals, which are explicitly mentioning, if I remember correctly, the idea of a capital surcharge, so an increase in their capital requirement for so-called systemic banks. So in some way there's on one side rules, direct intervention, on the other side more a kind of incentive which basically has a rationale because these banks benefit from a kind of conjectural guarantee, and you can actually see that empirically in the spreads they pay on their debt, and the other one is basically the incentive. The other issue is an older one, if you want. I mean, we're talking about global banks. You mentioned at the beginning that global problems need global solutions, so it's the balance between the, if you want, the domestic regulatory authority, supervisory power, and the supranational. We do actually have a new authority, European one, in the light of what you were mentioning before, coming from the de la Rosière recommendation, which is the European Banking Authority as well, just as we said on the other side, the European Systemic Risk Council. So your opinion about these two issues. Thank you.
Well, as you mentioned very rightly, we are now at a phase in the working out of the new prudentials, new global prudentials, of consulting with the industry. The decisions are normally taken around the end of the year, and it's extremely important in the present period that we are collecting all the remarks which the industry in particular, but I have to say also, of course, academia and observers can make. This idea of combining the minimization of the negative aspects of the difficulty that a major institution could have with the internalization of the systemic risk that they more or less implicitly are imposing to their own environment is an idea which has a lot of rationale, obviously. It's totally different from the idea that you pay a premium for your own guarantee, your own protection. The idea is, very unfortunately, a bankruptcy or collapse can happen, and it is something that has to be fully internalized because it could create, of course, major difficulty. At this stage, I would say we are listening to all, I am in particular listening to all remarks which are made. As I said, in any case, we have, at the moment of the decision, we will have, in the best of our judgment, to be sure that we do not permit the repetition of what has been observed in the past. And that is really something which everybody has to understand. It would not be acceptable. It's as simple as that. I know that it is difficult in the perspective of some market participants or institutions, because they are living now in a world which functions, I wouldn't say normally, but quasi-normally. And so they have a difficulty to understand why perhaps bold changes have to be introduced. As regards the authority at the level of Europe that would be responsible for micro-supervision, you know what is the present consensus in Europe. It has been examined. Now it is in front of the Parliament. The Council had considered that the level of cooperation it is accepting is the good one. It's absolutely clear that for a number of reasons one could have imagined to have a much more integrated micro-supervision of banks in particular, but not only of banks, at the level of the European Union as a whole. At this stage, I would say that we have to live with the decisions that have been prepared. Again, they are not yet crystallized in legislation because the Parliament is examining it. In parallel, as you said, they are examining the progress which will be made in the domain of micro-supervision, and also they are looking at the concept of the Systemic Risk Board, which has been decided in principle and still needs its own legislation. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, President Trichet. What this evening has been very interesting for us, and we particularly appreciated your openness in addressing these last questions. As you said in your remarks, we live in very special times of historic importance, and I'd like to stress that both our university and Corriere della Sera are strongly committed to the European project and to the need of addressing these global challenges through the improvement of multilateral institutions. So we hope to host you again in the near future and to witness hopefully some progress on the road of building better multilateral institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.